Today we are going to discuss the small open economy model with money under the fixed exchange rate regime. And this is the final lecture of macroeconomic theory. Hooray! So now let's begin the last journey. And please allow me to show you this big picture of the module for the last time. We are standing at the open economy with money, and this is the last model we are going to discuss. In retrospect, it is actually quite a long journey, but we built on our understanding step by step. In the beginning, we start with a very simple static model which focuses on the labor market, and we derived the intra-temporal conditions of the firm and the consumers. And then we move on to the dynamic model where we focus on the capital market and credit markets and derived the intertemporal conditions of the firm and the consumers. We then combine the static model and the dynamic model into an all-in-one real business or RBC model, and in this model we have both intratemporal condition and intertemporal conditions. Some extensions of the RBC model are discussed. For example, if we allow the search and matching cost, we will have the DMP model in the static version. And if we allow for asymmetric information, then we can explain more about the interest rate spread and limited commitment in the financial market. Next, we then introduce money into the RBC model, and then we find that money doesn't really matter if everything is perfect. However, if we have some imperfections, such as price rigidity, then money is no longer neutral. We discussed different types of money non-neutrality in our module, including the Friedman-Lucas model and New-Keynesian models. After that, we introduce open economy assumption into this RBC model with and without money. And if there is money, the analysis will differ depending on which exchange rate regime you adopt. We discussed the scenario under the flexible exchange rate regime. This lecture will focus on the scenario under the fixed exchange regime. Obviously, this lecture is closely linked with previous chapters. For example, you will have to understand how a monetary small open economy works under the flexible exchange rate regime so that you can compare this analysis with the fixed exchange rate regime. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the soft peg of the fixed exchange rate regime. Many countries adopt fixed exchange rate regime. A main benefit of adopting fixed exchange rate regime is to reduce the uncertainty due to the fluctuations of the exchange rate. For example, if the US is trading with China, the traders would be better off if the exchange rate between the Chinese yuan and the US dollars is kind of fixed, so that they don't have to worry about the fluctuations of the exchange rate and the risks of holding different currencies. If you are investing in exotic pairs such as the US dollars / Chinese yuan, then you should use the analysis under the fixed exchange rate regime rather than the one we have discussed in the previous lecture. Here are the learning objectives of this lecture. First, you have to know how fixed exchange rate regime is achieved and its drawbacks. Then we are going to apply this model with fixed exchange rate regime to analyze the effect of the three shocks we have discussed under the flexible exchange rate regime, and you can compare the difference between the two regimes. And finally, please do apply your knowledge to the practice so that you can turn knowledge into real profit. Now let's look at how fixed exchange rate regime is conducted. The type of exchange rate regime we consider here is soft peg, where the government fixes the nominal exchange rate within a band, but might devalue or revalue the currency occasionally. To fix the exchange rate, the government, usually the central bank of the country, chooses a target level to fix by buying or selling its foreign exchange reserves to balance the demand and supply of the forex market. For example, if there is a pressure of devaluation or depreciation, then there is an excessive demand for foreign currencies. In this case, the government should sell the foreign exchange reserve to meet the additional demand for foreign currencies until the market clears. On the contrary, if there is a pressure of revaluation or appreciation, then there is an excessive demand for domestic currencies. In this case, the government should buy the foreign exchange reserve to meet the additional demand for domestic currencies until the market clears. In summary, the government or central banks basically plays a critical role in maintaining the balance of the forex market to fix the exchange rate by buffering the shocks. The model of fixed exchange rate regime is almost identical to the model of flexible exchange rate regime. It also has the RBC kernel with intra- and intertemporal conditions. Goods market and money market have to clear at the same time. And small open economy assumption means exogenous interest rate, and PPP condition holds. However, the exchange rate E is now exogenously fixed. If an endogenous variable is now exogenous, it causes a mathematical trouble. It is like you have 3 equations and 3 unknowns previously. You can solve for all. But now you fix one of the 3 unknowns. In this case, you will have 3 equations but only 2 unknowns. The system of equations does not hold in general. In human language, it means that you simply cannot want everything. If the exchange rate is fixed, you will have to give up the control of something else. This is the money supply M. Under the fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank no longer has control over its own monetary policy M, because it must adjust the money supply to satisfy the market conditions for a given level of exchange rate. Therefore, M is now endogenous. Now let's look at the effect of a higher foreign price P star. Apply the 3-step approach again. Distinguish between the endogenous and exogenous variables. This has already been done in the previous slides. Because we focus on the change of P star, so all the other exogenous variables like E, Z, R star, and G are kept as constant. In the second step, we have to distinguish between the shifts along the curve and the shifts off the curve. A change in P star is a change of the non-axis variable in the money market. So we are analyzing shifts of curves rather than shifts along curves. Since E is now fixed, a higher P star on the right-hand side has to be cancelled out by a higher money supply M on the left-hand side because everything else are either too slow to adjust or fixed. This means a rightward shifts of both money demand curve and money supply curve. Compared to the flexible exchange rate regime, the money supply M stays still and the exchange rate E will drop. This is what is termed as imported inflation, because a higher foreign inflation induces a higher domestic inflation. To see this, recall the PPP condition. P equals E multiplied by P star. If E is artificially fixed, then a higher P star means a higher P. To summarize, a higher P star brings an appreciation pressure for the domestic currency or a dropping pressure of E, and the foreign reserve will rise under this condition. Turn to the analysis of the effect of a rise in the world interest rate R star. As in the flexible exchange rate regime, a rise in R star will shift the aggregate demand curve, resulting in a higher output Y. A higher R and a higher Y have opposite effects on the liquidity function L, but empirically, it is a positive overall effect. This means a rightward shift of the money demand curve. If we have a flexible exchange rate regime, then E will drop to cancel this effect on the demand side of the money market. However, in the fixed exchange rate regime, E is fixed, so the only way of restoring the balance in the money market is to adjust the money supply M to the right to fill the gap. To summarize, a higher interest rate results in an appreciation pressure of the domestic currency or a dropping pressure of E, and the reserve is going to rise. Finally, let's analyze the effect of a change in the exchange rate E. Under the fixed exchange rate regime, the government only considers a change of E when the productivity Z has a permanent change. Therefore, in this analysis, we will combine changes of the two exogenous variables. A common scenario is when there is a negative shock on productivity Z, resulting in changes in the input market and the output market as described in Chapter 15. In the real side of the economy, basically the output Y drops as Z drops. This means a lower liquidity function L and a leftward shift of the money demand function. If the government attempts to maintain the original exchange rate, it must reduce money supply from M1 to M2. However, that means a contractionary monetary policy and makes the economic condition even worse. Moreover, the central bank may also face a risk of exhaustion of its foreign exchange reserves. Under the devaluation pressure and the recession pressure, it is usually a wise choice or the only choice to allow the domestic currency to depreciate or allow the exchange rate to rise. To summarize, a decrease in productivity Z can result in the devaluation of domestic currency. George Soros made use of this prediction to win $1 billion on his short positions of Great Britain pounds in his battle with the Bank of England in 1992. And I really hope I can see one of you or some of you can become the next George Soros, because you really have a great potential. Some of the students in the trading game has already won over 200% profit rate, which is much higher than George Soros during the same period. Currency wars happened over and over again, repeating the same story we have told in the previous slide. It is not a war between individuals, but a war between an individual and a country. George Soros used the same trick to defeat the UK in 1992, Thailand in 1997, and Russia in 1998. The same pattern of all the currency wars is that first, the current account deteriorates, and then there is a pressure on devaluation of the currency. To maintain the fixed exchange rate, the central bank exhausts its reserves, and then they are forced to devaluate their currency. And George Soros finds the right timing to put a large quantity of short positions on this currency, only to speed up the collapse of the currency. So fragility against real shocks and hot money is an inevitable drawback of fixed exchange rate regime, and that is why many countries, including the UK, finally give it up. As mentioned earlier, another drawback of the fixed exchange rate regime is its big sacrifice on the control over monetary policy. The central bank must adjust money supply to achieve the fixed exchange rate, even if at the cost of a worse recession. This is summarized by the famous impossible trinity. It is argued that you cannot have all the three followings at the same time: fixed exchange rate, autonomous monetary policy, and capital mobility. This is the reason behind the collapse of the gold standard after the Great Depression and the failure of EMU after the global financial crisis. An interesting case is China, which defeated George Soros' attack in 1997. China was and is still maintaining a fixed exchange rate and autonomous monetary policy, but Chinese government has a very strict capital control. The Chinese government cannot stop hot money to flow into China, but it can effectively stop hot money to leave the country. In this way, it protected the financial system from attacks of the international arbitrages. This is actually another proof of the impossible Trinity theorem, because it has to give up capital mobility for the other two things. This is the end of the lecture and the end of the entire module of macroeconomic theory. I hope you enjoy the journey and learning by doing opportunity to turn knowledge into profit in the trading game. Thanks and goodbye. Have fun!